In the vast frozen theater of the Cold War, where paranoia fueled production lines and strategic necessity often outpaced engineering laws, there exists a machine that embodies the era's terrifying contradictions like no other. It was an aircraft that patrolled the Iron Curtain for 3 decades, carried tactical nuclear weapons, and intercepted NATO spy planes. It was built in the thousands, assigned to dozens of regiments, and flown by generations of pilots. Yet in the dusty bureaucratic archives of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, strictly speaking, it did not exist. It was the Yakovlev Yak-28, an aircraft so flawed that the State Commission refused to officially accept it into service, yet so indispensable that the Kremlin forced it to fly anyway. To understand the Yak-28 is to understand the Soviet Union in the late 1950s. It was a time of obsession with speed, a desperate race to breach the sound barrier, not just with experimental prototypes, but with frontline regiments. The subsonic world of the Ilyushin IL-28 Beagle was fading, rendered obsolete by the new American Century Series fighters. The Soviet Air Force needed a supersonic tactical bomber, and they needed it yesterday. Into this vacuum stepped Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev, a designer with enough political capital to bend reality, and he offered a machine that looked like speed itself. With its swept wings, underslung engine nacelles, and aggressive stance, it looked like the future. But beneath that polished aluminum skin lay a collection of compromises, joyful engineering optimism, and aerodynamic nightmares that would earn it a reputation as one of the most dangerous experiments to ever enter mass production. This was not a machine that pilots fell in love with. It was not the docile, reliable friend that the IL-28 had been. It was a beast that demanded absolute submission, a collection of systems that seemed to be fighting each other in flight. To the west, it was known by a trio of NATO reporting names: Brewer for the bomber, Firebar for the interceptor, and Maestro for the trainer, identities that hinted at its confused multi-role existence. But to the crews who walked out to it on freezing runways from East Germany to the Far East, it was simply the Yak, or sometimes affectionately and derisively, the comb or Greben, due to the bristling array of antennas and intakes that sprouted from its spine and belly in later variants. And every time they climbed the ladder, they knew they were strapping into a paradox, a plane that was officially unsafe, yet operationally essential. The physical presence of the machine on the ramp was imposing. It did not possess the sleek, blended curves of Western fighters like the Hunter or the F-100. It was industrial, purposeful, and distinctly Soviet. The fuselage was long and pencil-thin, following the area rule instructions of TCGI, the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, to minimize transonic drag. The fuselage had a subtle Coke bottle waist pinched in between the wings to compensate for the cross-sectional area of the massive engine nacelles. The metal skin itself was a canvas of rivets and unpainted duralumin, reflecting the harsh lights of the airfield. At full speed, the friction of the air heated certain panels to over 100 degrees Celsius, requiring specialized heat-resistant alloys in the nose and leading edges. It was a machine built to punish the air, not to negotiate with it. If the strategic decisions and engineering gambles that define the Cold War aviation race fascinate you, and you want to understand not just the specifications, but the stories behind these metal leviathans, make sure to subscribe. There are many more forgotten giants of the jet age that deserve this kind of forensic examination, and I will be bringing them to you. The genesis of the Yak-28 lay in the terrifying realization that the Soviet Union was losing the technological edge. The Korean War had proven the value of jet power, but the next war, the theoretical World War III, would be fought at Mach 1 and above. The requirement was simple on paper: a light bomber capable of delivering a tactical nuclear weapon at supersonic speeds, penetrating NATO air defenses before they could react. Yakovlev, always the astute politician, evolved his existing Yak-26 design, growing it into a larger, more powerful platform powered by the tumultuous new Tumansky R-11300 engines, the same power plants that would eventually become legendary in the MiG-21. But where the MiG-21 was a masterpiece of integrated design, the Yak-28 was a Frankenstein of conflicting requirements. The most immediate and striking visual feature of the aircraft, and the source of many of its operational headaches, was its landing gear. Conventional wisdom dictated a tricycle arrangement with a nose wheel and two main gear struts retracting into the wings or fuselage. But the Yak-28 was designed for speed, which meant thin, highly swept wings. There was simply no internal volume in the wing structure to house a massive landing gear strut and its high-pressure tire without creating large, drag-inducing blisters that would ruin the supersonic area rule. Yakovlev's engineers chose a bicycle configuration. The aircraft rested on two main struts located along the fuselage centerline, one under the cockpit and one aft of the wings, supported by two spindly outrigger wheels retracting into small fairings near the wingtips. While this solved the packaging problem, it introduced a handling nightmare that would plague the aircraft forever. On the ground, the Yak-28 did not sit level. The rear strut was often compressed differently than the front, or designed shorter, giving the aircraft a permanent, aggressive, nose-high attitude on the tarmac. It looked ready to leap, but in reality, it was waiting to bite. This bicycle arrangement meant that the pilot could not rotate the aircraft for takeoff in the traditional sense. In a normal plane, you pull back on the stick, the elevator pushes the tail down, the nose rises, the wing angle of attack increases, and you fly. In the Yak-28, the rear main gear was located so far behind the center of gravity that pulling back on the stick merely drove the rear tires harder into the concrete. The elevator lacked the authority to leverage the nose up against that fulcrum. Instead, the designers built the wings with a high angle of incidence. The pilot had to roar down the runway, holding the stick neutral or slightly aft, waiting for the speed to build until the wings generated enough lift to simply levitate the entire machine off the ground horizontally. It was a sensation described by pilots as unnerving, a passive wait for physics to take over while the end of the runway rushed closer at 300 kilometers per hour. Landing was arguably worse, specifically when the wind refused to cooperate. The outrigger wheels, dangling near the wingtips, turned the aircraft into a tripod with a very wide, unstable footprint. In a crosswind landing, a pilot usually sets the aircraft down in a crab or dips a wing into the wind. Do that in a Yak-28, and you would smash an outrigger into the runway. If that tiny wheel caught a runway light, a patch of ice, or soft soil, the leverage arm was so long that it could violently spin the aircraft around, snapping the strut or even tearing the wing structure. The crosswind limit was strictly enforced at roughly 6 to 8 meters per second. If the wind blew harder than that across the runway, the regiment stayed on the ground, regardless of the tactical urgency. Then there were the engines. The Tumansky R-11300 was a turbojet designed for high-altitude interception, optimized for the MiG-21's intake profile. On the Yak-28, however, these engines were mounted in pods underslung beneath the wings. This placement was aerodynamically problematic, creating significant interference drag where the nacelle met the wing, but operationally, it was catastrophic. The engine intakes were positioned impossibly low, hovering less than a meter above the tarmac. They became essentially two giant high-performance vacuum cleaners, eager to ingest anything that wasn't bolted down. Foreign object damage, or FOD, was a constant paranoid obsession for Yak-28 ground crews. A pebble, a washer, a lost button. Any of these could shatter the compressor blades of the fragile turbojets. Mechanics were forbidden from carrying loose change or pens in their pockets. The aprons were swept with religious fervor. In winter, the problem worsened. The low-hanging pods would suck up slush and ice, which would then melt and refreeze in the intake works, threatening to shatter the engine internals the moment the starter engaged. It was a high-maintenance diva of a propulsion system that required a clean room environment to operate in field conditions that were often muddy, frozen, or crumbling. But the environmental challenges were not limited to the outside of the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the pilot and navigator fought their own battle against the machine's life support systems. The cabin heating and pressurization relied on bleed air taken directly from the engine compressors. In a perfect world, this air is filtered and clean. In the worn-out seals of a Soviet tactical bomber, it often carried the acrid, oily tang of pyrolyzed lubricants. The smell of the Yak was a mixture of kerosene, hydraulic fluid, and burning oil that permeated flight suits and logbooks. It was so pervasive that many pilots flew with their oxygen masks locked on 100% flow from start to shutdown, isolating themselves from the toxic atmosphere of their own workplace. Then there was the liquid cooling situation, a topic of legendary status in Soviet aviation folklore. The sophisticated radar sets, specifically the Oriole-D in the Interceptor and the bombing radars in the Brewer, generated immense heat. To keep them functioning, the aircraft carried a significant quantity of coolant, a mixture of pure grain alcohol and distilled water. To the hardened ground crews stationed in remote garrisons in Siberia or the Urals, this tank was not a cooling system, it was a flying liquor cabinet. Despite strictly sealed valves and bitter additives meant to discourage consumption, liters of this supersonic booze inexplicably evaporated from the logs after every flight. The Yak-28, like the Tu-22 blinder after it, became a vital part of the regiment's shadow economy, its radar coolant traded for favors, better food, or simply a momentary escape from the bleak existence of garrison life. The engines also introduced a terrifying behavior known to crews as the jump. The aircraft's brakes were barely adequate for its weight, and the engines produced significant residual thrust even at idle. When the pilot pushed the throttles into afterburner for takeoff, the sudden surge of power, combined with the low-slung position of the engines relative to the center of mass, created a violent pitching moment. The nose strut would extend rapidly, causing the aircraft to bob and weave. If the pilot was holding the brakes too hard, the nose could dip dangerously low. If they released them too early, the acceleration was brutal. It required a delicate, practiced dance of throttle and brake that rookie pilots often struggled to master. Once in the air, the Yak-28 was fast, capable of reaching 1,800 kilometers per hour, or roughly Mach 1.5 at altitude. But it was not agile. The same thin, flexible wings that allowed for supersonic flight suffered from aeroelasticity. In high-G maneuvers, the wings would physically twist. If a pilot commanded a hard roll to the left, the aileron on the right wing would deflect downward to generate lift. But the force of the air on that aileron could twist the entire leading edge of the wing downward, effectively canceling out the lift or even reversing it. This phenomenon, known as control reversal, meant that at high speeds the aircraft's response to control inputs could be sluggish or unpredictable. Spin recovery was theoretically impossible. The T-tail would be blanked out by the fuselage wake in a stall, rendering the rudder useless, while the heavy engines out on the wings acted like a barbell, stabilizing the spin and preventing recovery. Spin prohibitions were written in bold red letters in the flight manual. Despite these terrifying characteristics, the Soviet military saw value in the platform. The Brewer bomber variants, the Yak-28B, I, and L, were tasked with the most dangerous mission of the Cold War, the delivery of the IAB-3000 tactical nuclear bomb. The internal bomb bay, squeezed into the fuselage between the bicycle gear bays, could carry roughly 3,000 kilograms of ordnance. But here, the official acceptance scandal reached its peak. During state trials, the Yak-28 demonstrated a fatal flaw as a supersonic bomber. When the bomb bay doors were snapped open at speeds exceeding Mach 1, the sudden disruption to the airflow along the belly of the aircraft caused violent trim changes. The plane would pitch and buffet, throwing the complex radar aiming sequence into chaos. The accuracy of supersonic bombing runs was dismal, often missing the target by kilometers. The main staff of the Air Force was furious. They refused to sign the acceptance certificate. They argued that a supersonic bomber that couldn't hit anything at supersonic speeds was useless. But the factories were already tooled up. The political momentum was unstoppable, and the Il-28s were effectively obsolete targets. The compromise was a uniquely Soviet solution. The aircraft was accepted for trial operation, a status it would technically hold for nearly its entire service life. The solution to the bombing inaccuracy was equally pragmatic. Pilots were simply instructed to slow down to subsonic speeds before opening the bay doors, largely negating the point of building a supersonic bomber in the first place. The versatility of the airframe, however, allowed it to mutate. If it couldn't be a perfect bomber, perhaps it could be something else. The Yak-28P Firebar interceptor variant stripped away the glass nose of the bombardier and replaced it with a solid, pointed radome housing the powerful Oriole D Eagle radar. The internal bomb bay was deleted and filled with a massive fuel tank to increase loiter time. Armed with two massive R-98 missiles, NATO code AA-3 Anub, hanging from the wings, the Firebar became a dedicated destroyer of bombers. In the interceptor role, the pilot became less of an aviator and more of a biological servo for the machine. The Firebar was equipped with the Lazur datalink system. Ground control intercept officers would beam flight instructions directly to the aircraft, which would appear as command needles on the pilot's instrument panel. The pilot didn't hunt for the target, he simply flew the needles, turning, climbing, and accelerating as commanded by a voice on the ground, hundreds of kilometers away. He was a trigger puller, a final safety verification in a kill chain automated to the highest degree possible with 1960s analog technology. Standard doctrine dictated firing 2 missiles at a target, one with a semi-active radar seeker and one with an infrared heat seeker, ensuring that if the enemy jammed the radar or flared the heat, the other missile would still find home. This reliance on automation was a philosophical shift. The pilots of the Great Patriotic War had been knights of the air, relying on eyesight and reflexes. The Yak-28P pilot was a system administrator, buried deep in the cockpit, often flying at night or in the soup of heavy cloud cover. He was completely dependent on the unspoken dialogue between the ground radar and his own aircraft's brain. He might never see the target he was killing. The interception would happen as a series of abstract symbols on a cathode ray tube. A blip, a lock-on tone, a launch authorization light, and then the sudden lurch as the heavy missiles dropped from the rails and ignited. It was a sterile, detached form of warfare that presaged the digital battlefield of the future, yet it was being conducted in an airframe that vibrated like a tractor and smelled like a garage. The contrast between the futuristic Lazur datalink and the brute force mechanics of the Yak airframe was the defining experience of the Firebar regiments. This operational reality brings us to the midpoint of our analysis, and perhaps the most important question for a modern observer. Knowing what we know now, the terrifying handling, the inability to bomb supersonically, the constant threat of engine foreign object damage, was this strategic gamble justified? Was it better to have a flawed supersonic fleet than a reliable subsonic one? Or was the Yak-28 a colossal waste of resources that could have been better spent refining a more conventional design? It is a question that cuts to the heart of military procurement, where the appearance of capability is often as important as the capability itself. Let me know what you think in the comments below. The human cost of the Yak-28 program was not theoretical. It was paid in the lives of crews who struggled with asymmetric thrust failures that were almost always fatal. With the engines mounted so far out on the wings, the loss of one engine on takeoff created a yawing moment that the vertical stabilizer often could not counter at low speeds. The aircraft would roll violently into the dead engine and cartwheel into the ground. These accidents were distressingly common. Yet, amidst the mechanical treachery, there were moments of profound heroism that defined the aircraft's legacy. The most famous occurred on April 6, 1966, in the skies over Berlin. Captain Boris Kapustin and Lieutenant Yuri Yanov were ferrying a new Yak-28P to their regiment in East Germany. As they approached the landing corridor, crossing into the airspace of West Berlin, a maneuver technically permitted but politically sensitive, disaster struck. Both engines surged and failed, starved of fuel or stalled by compressor issues. The silent jet, now a 20-ton glider with the glide ratio of a brick, was dropping toward the densely populated spree of West Berlin suburbs. Kapustin ordered his navigator, Yanov, to eject. But the Yak-28's ejection sequence was notoriously complex. In the bomber and early variants, the navigator sat in the glass nose ahead of the pilot and ejected downwards or upwards depending on the subvariant, but in the firebar, the layout was tandem. Yanov refused to eject. Some accounts suggest he feared the shift in the center of gravity would pitch the aircraft immediately into the apartment blocks below. Others suggest it was pure solidarity with his pilot. Kapustin wrestled the dying controls, steering the aircraft away from a cemetery filled with civilians and aiming for the dark waters of the Stosensee Lake. The aircraft slammed into the water. Both men were killed instantly. They saved hundreds of lives on the ground, an act of sacrifice that was immortalized in the Soviet poem and song, Huge Sky. But the Cold War allowed for no pure tragedies. Even as the bodies were being recovered with full military honors, posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Banner, a shadow game was unfolding beneath the surface of the lake. British intelligence, controlling that sector of Berlin, realized that a cutting-edge Soviet interceptor with the latest Oriole D radar had just fallen into their lap. The water was murky, and the political situation was explosive, but the opportunity was too great to ignore. While Soviet officers negotiated on the shore for the return of the bodies and the wreckage, reports that surfaced years later suggest that Royal Navy divers were conducting a covert underwater salvage operation right under the noses of the Russians. Working in the sludge of the lakebed, they reportedly managed to access the shattered nose cone. They didn't take the whole radar, that would have been obvious. Instead, they carefully removed critical components: the magnetron, the waveguides, and parts of the engine turbine blades. These pieces were whisked away to Farnborough for metallurgical and electronic analysis, revealing the secrets of the Soviet Union's most advanced interceptor before the wreckage was solemnly hoisted by a crane and returned to the waiting Soviet military trucks. The Yak-28, even in death, remained a chaotic intersection of heroism and espionage. Beyond the bomber and interceptor, the Yak-28 found its true calling in the shadows. The Yak-28R Brewer D was a dedicated reconnaissance platform, using the glass nose and bomb bay for high-resolution cameras and electronic listening gear. But the most exotic and arguably most successful variant was the Yak-28PP Brewer E, the electronic warfare escort. This aircraft was unmistakable. Its fuselage was bristling with antennas, earning it the nickname Porcupine. Its mission was to fly alongside strike packages, blasting out active jamming noise to blind NATO air defense radars. The bomb bay was filled with bucket jamming operational modules, and the engine nacelles were modified to dispense chaff, millions of tiny fiberglass strips coated in aluminum to create false radar targets. The Porcupine was perhaps the most hated variant by its crews, not because of the danger, but because of the radiation. The high-powered jamming equipment emitted significant electromagnetic energy, and despite shielding, pilots and navigators often complained of headaches and health issues after long missions. It was an aircraft that literally radiated hostility. Yet it was so effective, or rather, the lack of a suitable replacement was so acute, that the electronic warfare variants soldiered on long after the bombers and interceptors had been scrapped. They served well into the 1990s, flying under the flag of an independent Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a testament to the durability of the airframe, if not its sophistication. Flying the Porcupine required a special kind of fatalism. Unlike their interceptor brethren who carried missiles, or the bombers who had speed and altitude as their defense, the electronic warfare crews were unarmed targets. Their job was to turn on the bouquet jammers, lighting themselves up like a beacon on every enemy radar screen in the theater, in order to protect the strike group hiding in their electronic shadow. They were the first thing the enemy would shoot at. To make matters worse, the chaff dispensing system, located in the underside of the engine nacelles, was a mechanical nightmare. It chopped fiberglass bundles into specific lengths to match the enemy's radar wavelength. The dust from this process, combined with the omnipresent hydraulic leaks, created a sticky, grinding paste that coated the underside of the wings. Crews joked that the best way to clean a Yak-28 PP was to fly it through a thunderstorm, but in reality it required hours of scrubbing significantly, increasing the workload on already overstretched ground personnel. When we compare the Yak-28 to its contemporaries, the trade-offs become stark. The American B-66 destroyer, roughly analogous in role, opted for potted engines but retained a high wing and heavy reliable systems. It was a truck compared to the Yak's race car pretensions. The British Blackburn Buccaneer, arriving slightly later, solved the low-level strike problem with brute strength and boundary layer control, creating a rock-steady platform that the Yak could never hope to match in turbulence. And the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo, the closest American equivalent in terms of the supersonic twin-engine interceptor concept, shared the Yak's tendency for terrifying pitch-up characteristics, but benefited from more advanced avionics and a more conventional landing gear arrangement. The tragedy of the Yak-28 was that it was a configuration dead end. The potted engines on a flexible swept wing proved to be an aerodynamic limitation that couldn't be engineered away. The next generation of Soviet tactical bombers, the Sukhoi Su-24 Fencer, would abandon this layout entirely, utilizing variable geometry swing wings to solve the problem of needing high speed for the dash and high lift for takeoff. The Su-24 placed the engine safely inside the fuselage, close to the center line, eliminating the asymmetric thrust danger that had killed so many Yak pilots. So, what is the legacy of the Yak-28? It is easy to dismiss it as a failure, a plane that was never officially good enough to be accepted. But that would be a mistake. For 30 years, this dangerous experiment held the line. It was the bridge between the rudimentary jets of the post-war era and the sophisticated weapon systems of the late Cold War. It forced Soviet industry to master the production of supersonic tactical aircraft. It taught a generation of pilots to respect the unforgiving laws of high-speed aerodynamics. It was a machine built of compromises, flawed in conception and terrifying in execution. But it flew. It did the job. In the end, the Yak-28 stands as a monument to a specific moment in human history, where the fear of being second best drove nations to build machines that pushed the very limits of what was possible, often at the expense of what was sensible. It was the ultimate peace through superior firepower bluff, a bomber that couldn't aim, an interceptor that flew itself, and a landing gear system that frightened its own pilots more than the enemy. It was magnificent, terrible, and unforgettable. If you found this analysis useful, a like helps more people discover these deep dives. Thanks for watching.